Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1, Below the Surface. Elliot Hammond thought he knew everything there was to know about underwater welding. After 15 years of repairing pipelines and ship hulls deep beneath the waves, he had developed an intimate relationship with the ocean, both its beauty and its cruelty. But the contract for Delta Rig 7 felt different from the start. The rig was abandoned 5 years ago after a series of mysterious accidents. But now, a new company was resurrecting it, promising fat paychecks for those willing to work on its dilapidated frame. Elliot needed the money, so he ignored the stories. Workers spoke of strange sounds deep underwater, lights flickering where no light should be, and divers never returning from the depths. Ghost stories, he thought. Nothing more. Elliot's team, diver Caleb, tender Jack, and supervisor Erica, were professionals. Yet, as they descended into the inky water surrounding Delta Rig 7, a sense of unease took root in all of them. The deeper they went, the more the sunlight vanished, replaced by the cold glow of their equipment. It wasn't just the dark. It was the feeling that something was down there, waiting. Elliot's first task seemed simple: weld a structural beam near the base of the rig, 200 feet below the surface. The current was stronger than he liked, tugging at him as if the ocean itself wanted to pull him deeper. Caleb floated nearby, his flashlight cutting through the water like a pale sword. "See that?" Caleb's voice crackled over the comms. "See what?" Elliot asked, trying to focus on his work. "There, movement. Starboard side. Near the wreckage." Elliot turned his headlamp. Nothing but twisted metal and a forest of barnacles. "Just your eyes playing tricks," he said. "Get a grip." But Caleb wasn't convinced. As the hours passed, his paranoia spread to the others. Jack, monitoring from above, reported odd interference on the sonar, a series of blips moving too fast and erratically to be fish. Erica dismissed it as a glitch, but her voice betrayed unease. On the second dive, Elliot noticed something strange. The water felt alive. Not just in the usual way currents flow, but as if it were reacting to him, pulling him closer to the sunken beams he was welding. And then he heard it. At first, it was faint, a hum that rose and fell like a distant song. Then it grew louder, words forming from the vibrations in the water. They were muffled and distorted, but unmistakable. "Come closer, find us." "Did you hear that?" he asked Caleb. "Hear what?" "The voices." Caleb hesitated. "You've been down too long, man. Get your head straight." But Elliot wasn't imagining it. Every time he turned his torch to another weld, the voices followed, growing clearer. "You can't leave us. Join us." When they surfaced, Elliot didn't mention the voices again. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, something unseen lurking just beyond the range of their lights. On the third dive, Caleb vanished. He was supposed to inspect a section of the rig further out, a quick 15-minute task. But when Elliot called him over the comms, there was no response. "Caleb, report." Erica barked from the surface. Nothing. Elliot swam toward Caleb's last known location. His flashlight beam caught the faint shimmer of Caleb's tether, dangling uselessly in the current. The line had been severed, cleanly, as though sliced by a blade. And then Elliot saw the blood. A faint crimson cloud swirling upward, dissipating in the darkness. Get out of there! Erica yelled. Now! Elliot swam back to the rig, heart hammering in his chest. As he ascended, he thought he saw a figure below him, pale and human-like, but with eyes that glowed faintly green. It watched him for a moment before disappearing into the blackness. Elliot refused to dive again, but Erica insisted they finish the job. With Caleb gone, the work fell to him and Jack. On the final dive, they reached the deepest part of the rig, 300 feet down. The temperature dropped sharply, and visibility was almost zero. The voices returned, louder than ever, accompanied by a strange vibration that rattled their gear. You are not welcome here. Leave or suffer. Elliot turned to Jack. We need to abort. But Jack wasn't moving. He was staring into the darkness, his eyes wide with terror. And then Elliot saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a grotesque figure, a skeletal diver clad in rusted gear, seaweed clinging to its body. Its jaw hung open, as if screaming silently. Behind it, more figures appeared, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though puppeteered by unseen strings. Surface! Now! Elliot shouted, pulling Jack's arm. But it was too late. The figures swarmed them, their icy hands clawing at their suits. Jack's regulator was ripped from his mouth, and his scream was swallowed by the water. Elliot kicked wildly, managing to escape the grasp of the figures. As he ascended, he looked down one last time. Jack was gone, and the ghostly divers were staring up at him, their glowing eyes piercing through the void. Elliot never returned to the water. He left Delta Rig 7 the next day, but the nightmares followed him. In his dreams, he was back in the depths, surrounded by the dead. They whispered to him, their voices full of rage and sorrow. 2 months later, Delta Rig 7 was abandoned once again after more divers went missing. The company never released a full report, but those who worked there spoke of strange disturbances, equipment failures, unexplainable accidents, and, most chillingly, the sound of muffled voices echoing through the water. To this day, no one knows what lies beneath Delta Rig 7. But one thing is certain, some places are meant to be left alone. Story 2, Depths of Despair. The ocean is a place of wonder and terror, a vast expanse of unknown that swallows light and sound whole. For Miles Carter, a veteran underwater welder, the deep sea was his workplace, his battleground, and sometimes his sanctuary. But on this particular job, the abyss would become his nightmare. Miles was contracted to repair the structural framework of an old oil rig, Oceanic Sentinel, decommissioned decades ago. It was rumored to have been abandoned after a catastrophic accident. Though the details were hazy, the company avoided questions, and the paycheck was too generous for Miles to refuse. As he signed the contract, a chill crept up his spine. But he dismissed it as anxiety. After all, he had faced worse. The repair site was 300 feet below the surface, where sunlight barely reached. The welders worked in shifts, with teams of 2 for safety. Miles was paired with Eli, a newcomer eager to prove himself. Their descent into the depths began with the hum of the winch lowering their diving bell into the inky blackness. Don't worry, Miles said, masking his own unease. Stick close, and you'll be fine. The words felt hollow. As they reached the rig, their helmet lights illuminated twisted metal and algae-covered beams. The structure groaned like a living thing under the pressure of the water. Miles directed Eli to start cleaning a joint for welding while he inspected the framework. The first hour passed uneventfully. The silence broken only by the occasional crackle of their comms. But then, something shifted. A faint, rhythmic knocking echoed through the water. "Eli, you hear that?" Miles asked, his voice tense. "Yeah," Eli replied, pausing his work. "Could be just the current." Miles knew better. The knocks were too deliberate. Like someone, or something, was mimicking the sound of tools on metal. He scanned the darkness, his beam piercing through the gloom, but saw nothing. Still, the sense of being watched was undeniable. "Let's keep moving," Miles said, trying to focus on the task. But the knocking continued, growing louder and closer, as if the abyss itself was calling them. The next day, they descended again, this time joined by Marcus, the team lead. Marcus dismissed the strange noises, attributing them to settling debris. Miles wasn't convinced but said nothing. As they worked deeper into the rig, the knocking returned. This time, it was accompanied by faint whispers, indistinct but chilling. Eli froze, his voice trembling over the comms. Did you hear that?" "Stay focused," Marcus barked. But his tone betrayed his own unease. Miles turned just in time to see Eli's light flicker out. A moment later, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the comms. His beam darted toward Eli's last known location. But all he saw was an empty harness drifting in the water. "Eli!" Miles shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response. Only static. Marcus ordered an immediate ascent. But as they rose, Miles swore he saw a shadow moving in the depths, a shape too large and too alien to be human. It lingered just beyond the reach of his light, then vanished into the black. Eli's disappearance was ruled an accident. But Miles and Marcus knew better. The whispers had grown louder, the knocking more insistent. The team's morale deteriorated. But the company insisted they complete the job. That night, Miles dreamed of the rig. In his mind's eye, it wasn't an industrial structure, it was a tomb. Twisted faces pressed against the metal walls, their mouths open in silent screams. When he awoke, his hands were trembling. The next dive was worse. As they worked, Marcus suddenly convulsed, clutching his helmet. "It's in my head," he screamed. "Make it stop." Before Miles could react, Marcus unlatched his safety line and swam into the darkness. Miles chased after him. But Marcus was gone. Left alone, Miles felt the weight of the ocean pressing in. The whispers now distinct words. "Leave this place." Miles couldn't abandon the job, not when Eli and Marcus's bodies were still unaccounted for. On his final dive, he was alone, against protocol. But he needed answers. He reached the rig's core, where the metal seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. There, he found a journal sealed in a watertight container. Inside were entries from a former foreman who detailed the Oceanic Sentinel's history. The rig had been built over an ancient seabed that locals warned was cursed. During its operation, workers reported strange occurrences, missing tools, eerie noises, and inexplicable accidents. The final entry was chilling. "We've disturbed something that should have been left buried. It won't let us leave." As Miles read, the knocking returned, deafening now. He turned to see the shadow again. But this time, it had form, a grotesque amalgamation of human and marine life. Its glowing eyes filled with malice. Miles fought to ascend. But the creature grabbed him. Its cold, slimy appendages pulling him deeper. Desperate, he activated his emergency flare. The burst of light momentarily blinding the creature. He escaped to the surface, gasping for air. But the whispers followed him even there. Miles quit underwater welding. But the ocean never let him go. He moved inland, far from any water. But the knocking haunted his nights. Doctors called it PTSD, Miles called it a warning. One evening, he found wet footprints leading from his bathtub to his bed. The last sound he ever heard was the knock of something tapping against his bedroom door. Story 3: The Depths of Darkness. Every underwater welder knows the risk of their job, the immense pressures of the deep, the ever-looming possibility of a catastrophic equipment failure, and the isolation of working beneath layers of cold, black water. But what Marcus Castillo didn't anticipate was the unnatural horror waiting in the depths. The seasoned diver, hired to repair the supports of an aging offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, was no stranger to the abyss. This job, however, was different. The reports were vague but unsettling, a structural failure deep within the rig, accompanied by strange, garbled sounds picked up by underwater microphones. Some crew members swore it sounded like whispers. Marcus didn't believe in ghost stories, but he couldn't shake the unease in the captain's voice as he briefed him. The sun was setting as Marcus suited up on the rig. The sea glistened red, a foreboding hue that made the already ominous task feel worse. The dive supervisor, a gruff man named Dawson, gave him a thumbs up from the control room. "Get in. Get it done. And get out." Dawson's voice crackled over the radio. "Don't stay down there any longer than you need to." The cold water enveloped Marcus as he descended. His headlamp cut a narrow beam through the inky blackness, illuminating the skeletal structure of the rig below. He could hear the rhythmic hiss of his oxygen supply and the occasional creaks of the rig as it swayed in the underwater currents. When he reached the base, something felt off. The metal framework was corroded far beyond what he had anticipated. Rust had eaten through massive beams, some twisted into unnatural shapes as though bent by an impossible force. He shivered, blaming the cold. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, an intermittent crackling, like static on a radio. Marcus paused, his welding torch suspended midair. The noise grew louder, morphing into whispers that seemed to echo inside his helmet. "Did you hear that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Static. Then Dawson's reply, "Hear what?" Marcus shook his head and resumed work. But the whispers didn't stop. The welding process was slow, and every moment felt like an eternity. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see another diver. But the void stared back at him. As he worked, the beam of his headlamp swept across something unusual. A strange growth clung to the metal, a black, organic mass that pulsed faintly. He moved closer, his gloved hand brushing it. The substance recoiled as though alive, releasing a dark, inky cloud that dissolved into the water. Marcus recoiled, his heart pounding. "Dawson, there's something down here. Some kind of growth on the structure. Don't touch it." Dawson barked. "Just finish the job and get back up here." But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't random noises anymore. They were voices. "Leave." Marcus froze. The voice was clear and sharp, cutting through the static. It wasn't coming from his radio. It was inside his helmet. Panic set in. Marcus decided to abandon the task and ascend. But when he turned to follow his safety line, it was gone. His lifeline had vanished, leaving him alone in the darkness. "Dawson. I've lost my line. Guide me back." Static was his only reply. The water around him grew colder, the whispers more insistent. Shadows swirled at the edges of his headlamp's beam, moving closer. Marcus swung the light wildly, but the figures stayed just out of reach, circling him like predators. His breathing quickened, fogging up his visor. He was running out of air. Then he saw it. A shape emerged from the darkness, immense and otherworldly. It was a mass of writhing tendrils and gleaming eyes, its form shifting constantly as though the water itself had come alive. The whispers rose to a deafening cacophony, each voice pleading or threatening. "Join us." Marcus tried to swim away, but the creature's tendrils shot forward, ensnaring him. His suit compressed as though a great weight had settled on him, the pressure threatening to crush him. His headlamp flickered, and in the brief flashes of light, he saw the faces. They were human, dozens of them, staring at him from within the creature's mass. Their mouths moved in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. "No!" Marcus thrashed. But his strength was fading. The whispers turned to laughter, cold and mocking. Above him, the faint glimmer of the surface was still visible, but it might as well have been a million miles away. When the dive team sent another welder down the following day, they found nothing. Marcus was gone, his equipment missing. The only trace was his safety line, frayed and floating aimlessly in the current. The oil rig was abandoned shortly after, its repairs deemed too dangerous. But locals say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely near the shore, you can hear the whispers rising from the depths. And sometimes, they call your name.